Thank you, Patricia. Thank you all for being here. Thank you all for being here too. Thank you, Malaprops, for doing both an in-person and live streamed event so that readers near and far can share this event with us. So appreciated. Local independent bookstores are so important. So we'd love for you to buy our books, but if something else appeals to you, just please make sure you buy books here because these are important parts of our community and that's how we keep them here.
Yeah, I echo the thanks, and I always like to quote Barry Lopez, who said that bookstores and librarians are the last great defenders of the written word. And I will also add readers, because without you, readers and buyers of books, we would not be here. So many thanks all around. I wanted to say a little bit about how I know Deb. The mentorship program that I run is a little different than show up and get your pages workshopped, get feedback, and go fix things. I really seek out writers who care about craft and who want to shape a story from a place of deep care. Um, it's getting easier to find those writers, but for many years it was hard. However, when I met Deb, I knew that we would hit it off, and it was wonderful. We spent about 8 months working together. I don't think she needed me much, but we had a good time. But what I can say about a debut and a debut novel is that it is so much work. It is so much work. It's like, oh, how long did it take you to write? And you could say like 5 years or like 45. Like every day that I lived and breathed on this planet would be the answer to how long it takes to write a novel. So I'm just really honored to get to be the local person who hangs out with Deb. I can't do DJing with Deb tonight, and to celebrate this exciting launch. So thank you for including me in your story.
Thank you, Katie. I appreciate that you came here to do this. And boy, you're right. I know now I have at least one running friend here. And I use that metaphor because my debut was for sure not a sprint. Um, and it was maybe even more than a marathon. It was kind of more like an ultra marathon because this book started in on a Monday morning in July of 2008 when I was about to start a 5-day class in writing the first novel. And I had been working on something for about a year that I thought was my first novel. But that morning I figured out the story I really needed to tell. And that's what's so important. You have to tell it. Otherwise you give up on the ultra marathon. So No More Empty Spaces is the story of Will Ross. He's a divorced American geologist who is beyond bored with his desk job on the expansion of the Philadelphia port. And he finds a dam that's being constructed in Turkey that has an incredibly problematic foundation. And I know we have some civil engineers in the audience tonight, so maybe we'll get some questions about that. And he signed on to work on it as the chief foundation geologist. And 2 weeks before he's going to leave, he finds that his ex-wife is not taking care of their children. They're taking care of her. And he decides to take the kids with him because he can't leave them with her. The problem is the kids think they're only going for their usual 2-week stint of shared custody, not to live there. So once Will gets to Turkey, he finds himself struggling for control of his family, of the work, the landscape the dam is going to be built on, and ultimately himself. And what I hope you'll find is that the landscape, because I am a geologist, I hope you'll find that the landscape is as much a character in the novel as the characters who are walking that landscape.
That was my experience, and I love reading place-based work. So although this is not on the script, but at some point I'm so curious to hear about the like geology. I think rocks, hard stuff, and then you like hang out on water. So that's I'll put that out there. But for now, since this novel does focus on geology, I'm really curious about how you weave it in and why was it so important?
Well, a couple of people have asked me things like, why did I transition from being a geologist to a writer? And I don't see it that way. For me, I feel so lucky that I got to do what I love for my living for 30 plus years. There were days as a geologist, I'd be walking in the field thinking, I do this for nothing. I can't believe they're paying me to do this. I didn't tell my clients that, but I feel very lucky, and I love the earth and I love the geologic processes that shape it. And I'm an avid reader, but I read almost all fiction. And so I decided to work on the craft so that I could translate the wonder I feel for non-scientist readers. So that's how that started. And Will is inspired by my late husband, who did work on a dam in Turkey during that time frame. And I just loved the idea of not only translating geology and geologic processes, but what applied geologists and engineers do to just sort of, again, translate that for people who don't understand it. And I think that, you know, it's a wonderful metaphor, foundations, right?
And the title itself, No More Empty Spaces.
There's a story behind that too. And that's why in conversation is so much fun.
Yeah, I want to hear it. If there's time, I want to hear it.
So yeah, but you know, the foundations we build on are really important, literally and figuratively, and that fits just so nicely into telling a story. But the title itself is a really wonderful illustration of how it can work well between a writer and a publisher, because my working title was different. So for many years, I had no working title, which actually felt like a really big empty space for me. And then the working title was inundations. And it was problematic because not everybody knew what it meant or how it was applied. I had two friends who both had PhDs and said, well, what does that mean? Which I was kind of surprised about. Like, if you have a PhD, you should know how to use a dictionary, right? So, but in any case, I knew there were some problems with that title, but I hadn't thought of anything better. And my publisher was very sensitive when she approached me, but she said, how do you feel about retitling? And I said, I feel really good about it, but I haven't thought of anything better. So she had an assistant editor read it specifically for titling. And they sent me a list of about 8. And they didn't number them necessarily as far as priority went, but No More Empty Spaces was at the top. And it kind of struck me right away. And none of the others resonated for me at all. And I just love it. And I also love what they did with the cover. It's because the cover designer is also a writer, and she talked about how these vertical lines were metaphorical for the dam for her, that it was the vertical structure that held the river back, and that she used the blue and the vertical lines to represent the water it was holding back.
That's awesome. Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. I can't say too much more because I feel like if I expound on the metaphor I see in the title, I'll give things away. But suffice it to say that, you know, you can have empty spaces in a foundation, in your life, in your soul, in your family unit, how you view yourself. So I really feel like you did bring it to life. I mean, you brought the landscape to life. I learned awesome things. And I don't think in geologic time, I've always admired it. I can't do it, but it brought it into like a world that I could relate to. So that was pretty fun as a reader.
Thank you. That's certainly what I was trying to do. And I think it's one of the things we talk about craft.
Yeah.
That I had to work on really hard at in the craft was, you know, translating the technical stuff into the story, weaving it in a way that didn't distract. Or a long ago writing teacher called it the fictional dream, that you want your readers to be in a fictional dream. And if they're stopped by a sentence that feels like a textbook, or too technical, or they can't understand that sentence, and they're going to start reading that sentence over and over again, they're out of the fictional dream, they're out of the story.
Yeah, yeah. You haven't, well, there's a lot of scenes, but I know there's one that lends itself well to being read where you were grappling with some issues that I had to grapple with, which is both of my books are about the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, which I have not personally experienced. So I had a lot of research to do, and also a lot of the same challenges. Like, how do you just like dump this information in without ruining all the great fun of these characters' lives? So actually in reading your book, it was really fun to see another writer. I don't want to say struggling, but I know, like, I could see the work behind it. I was like, oh man, how did she do that? That must have been so hard. So I'd love it if you could read an example from that, and then we can really get your voice in this book in the room.
Yeah, so this scene is in Will, the geologist's point of view, and it's participatory, everybody, and everybody. There's an exercise that he's illustrating how he's doing this analytical work he's doing, and he's explaining it to the young American woman who teaches the English-speaking children at the dam site. Her name is Paula. As the autumn days cooled and shortened, Will rushed his team to finish drilling the new boreholes throughout the footprint of the dam. Many nights, he spread borehole logs from that day out on the table after dinner and drew cross sections. And I'll just qualify this by saying this happened in the 1970s when we did do borehole logs on paper, and we did draw cross sections by hand, which we don't do anymore. What are you doing? Paula asked one of those evenings, looking up from grading papers. Taking the data from each borehole, which are recorded on these logs, and correlating them from one to the next. Try this, he says. Put your hands up in front of your eyes, palms out, close together, about an inch apart, like this. And look through the narrow space between them, then turn and look again, and again, and again. And then from those 4 narrow views, describe what the whole room looks like. That's what doing a subsurface investigation is like. Those narrow snapshots are like the boreholes we drill. The cross sections I'm working on are like the description of the room. She did what he said, and one of her bright hazel eyes peeked through the space between her hands as she turned to get the different views of the room. That seems hard, getting the whole picture from just that, she said. It isn't easy, but it's always interesting. Now, we locate the boreholes based on our best understanding of the geology at the surface from the mapping, he continued, which you didn't get from this exercise. Still, it's a big puzzle we put together, piece by piece by piece. As more boreholes were completed, Will drafted cross-section after cross-section, both parallel and perpendicular to the dam's alignment. He extrapolated what he couldn't see from what he could, reading the story in the rocks, and reading between the lines of the story into the empty spaces of those same rocks.
Empty spaces. That was wonderful to hear that in your voice. So I promised Deb too that I would say a little bit about some of the research I had to do and the craft challenges that came with it in weaving that into these 2 works of fiction. So my first book, Flashes of War, is flash fictions and short stories set in both Iraq and Afghanistan. And then there were several characters from that book that just really just wouldn't leave me alone, and they reappear and share this 3-day journey in my novel, Still Come Home. So I lucked out. I was thinking about this on the drive here, in that one of my protagonists is a second lieutenant, and he's in charge of this mission, which takes 3 days, which is the length of the novel. And so he has to give a lot of orders. So that was like great. Like if I needed to get information out there, I could just make sure the lieutenant had a reason to talk. So that was actually one kind of difficult challenge, easily solved. Then there are other ways in which I think that writers who are doing a lot of research for fiction and nonfiction we can fall into traps because there's so much information. So like, how much do you leave in? How much do you leave out? When do you stop? Sometimes the research is more fun than the writing, you know, and you get this whole avoidance thing. But if we can sort of create like a container where the story takes place, a premise, there's actually a lot we don't have to say. So for example, the premise of my novel is that we're in wartime in Afghanistan. I did not have to explain why the characters were at war. Even if someone reading the book didn't understand the long wars, as they're now called, it's a given. The premise is it's a given. So I, as the writer, am freed up from all that research. I may need to know it in order to write accurately, but the reader doesn't have to come along for every, you know, hundreds of pages of that backstory. So that was just like one lesson that I learned. And then another was, this is another thing we have in common, was when we're telling a story through multiple points of view, through drafting, I learned that the role that American dollars play in this story ended up being quite crucial. And it became clear to me that the only real way to show truly how complex the movement of American money is in real life, from here to Afghanistan, and what is in the novel, was to show it from different points of view. So I'll read a little bit from that later, but that, from the research and prose and craft perspective, like that gave me a leg up, because I could show, like, here's how an Afghan woman would perceive this, and here's how a second lieutenant would perceive it, and here's how someone working for the Taliban would perceive it. And then together, this very complicated thing, the appearance of American cash on Afghan soil, at least becomes accessible to the reader without having to read, you know, tomes.
Right, right. And I think that's so important, these complicated issues. There's so much reading and writing that goes into a book that doesn't appear in the book itself. And it's just part of the process. And I've had people ask me why I chose 3 points of view and how did I choose them. And this book started in only the point of view of Will in the first person. So it was I did this. And what I realized was that there was too much of the time that I felt like his voice wasn't authentic. And if it didn't feel real to me when I was writing it, I knew it wouldn't work for readers. And the thing about Will is he's pretty complicated and interesting, and to me anyway. I hope he will be to you. But he's not the most self-aware guy. So how do you as a writer reveal a character who doesn't know themselves very well? And that's when I started working with other characters, because I used his 15-year-old son, Kevin, and the young American woman who teaches the children to start revealing more about Will to the reader, because you have to know more about him or you won't get engaged in his story. So yeah, it's interesting. So did you choose the multiple points of view for that particular theme? Is that how it started?
It's a good question. How did it start? Oh man. It's been a while. It did start with those 3, but there was this grand phase of draft number 5 where I went so far astray. And I'm really glad that I had help figuring that out. But it started with Nathan, the second lieutenant, and Asaya, the young Afghan woman who you'll hear from later, and then her husband, Rahim, who reluctantly works for the Taliban. They were there all along somehow. And then I was really getting stuck with plot. And I had this great idea one day to interject these other little voices. And I introduced, you know, like the provincial warlord and the helicopter pilot who flew in the crates of American cash and whatnot. And oh, I had so much fun. And I just popped them in here and there, and it like destroyed the novel. It just did not work. So that was a sign to me that I had made the right choice about the 3 points of view, but that I had a plot problem. and adding more wasn't the solution. I had to think my way through it, and I sort of had to reposition certain secrets in the novel and make them revealed, like chapter 1.
Gotcha.
So point of view, I think in that way was almost instructional as I revised along. And I heard you say a little bit about that too, when you started kind of not believing in Will.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
so did the points of view for you help draw out the theme, or did you know the theme right away and the characters kind of rose up to meet it?
Both, actually. So I think the points of view that ended up in the book revealed themselves when I realized I had to reveal more of Will. And I knew the direction I was writing in, but right from the start, I knew how we define progress and whether all so-called progress is as positive as we'd like to think it is, would be a theme. And if I thought about it that way, I would want to get a paper bag to hyperventilate into, because it just felt so huge. And I had to remind myself to just write one scene at a time and reveal that a little bit along the way. And then as the characters did what they needed to do, other themes revealed themselves to me.
Okay.
Like, what can we control and what can't we control? And that was also on a personal level, on a family level, with respect to the dam, and things like that. And then another theme that really revealed itself, I think after I finished the book, was that almost every character in No More Empty Spaces is somehow finding home, which seems maybe a little counterintuitive, because it's an American family and they're expats. They're living overseas. And so they're working on finding their homes when they're away from home. And I didn't even realize that I was revealing that until I read another book and was discussing it in relationship to my novel. Yeah. So did you have any things reveal themselves that surprised you along the way?
I mean, yeah, well, there was a lot that surprised me along the way. But like you, I knew, I mean, it's still true today, even though I'm not writing about war at this particular moment, that all the theme really is, folks. And I'm saying this as someone who's terrified to take an English class. Like, I had to take it in high school, and then I never took an English class again because it was super intimidating to me. Like, what is theme? Like, that's like asking me, like, where's the fountain of youth? It's like, but all I think it really is like what we care about. Like, what do you care about? What is at stake at the end of the day? What will you, hold your flag up for? And for me, for a very, very long time, even before I identified as a writer, I've always been interested in this question, like, of where moral authenticity lies. So, like, if you're stuck in a situation where you can do everything right and still be dead wrong, which, by the way, is the definition of war, perhaps, like, then what? Like, where there's no moral terrain, like, whatever you do next is perhaps your most authentic action in your entire life. So it's those moments that I was interested in studying. So I actually could think about that. I had to think about that because it mattered so much to me to try and explicate it in the context of these wars as a tax-paying citizen and as someone who uses language like everyone in this room. And I felt like our language was being hijacked, especially during like the height of the global war on terror, like the way that words like patriot and hero or infidel or mission accomplished, these phrases all of a sudden took on a very, very different tone and gained power in some really scary ways. And so I had opinions about it, and that fueled theme. So I should stop there because I could go on and on about that, but I would certainly love to hear more from your various points of view if you have a few excerpts that you can read.
I would love to. So the 3 points of view in my book are Will, his 15-year-old son Kevin, and the 3 children are his 15-year-old son Kevin, his 12-year-old son, Rob, and his 4-year-old daughter, Dee Dee. And then Paula becomes very important. She's a young West Virginian woman who has come to the dam site to teach the English-speaking children there. And you'll hear a little bit from each of them. The first one I'm going to read is from Kevin's point of view. And Paula has taken, Will is working, he can't get away. It's the fall break in school. And Paula has taken the 3 Ross children and Rob's good friend, who's a young Turkish boy by the name of Timur. He's the son of the chief engineer, the Turkish engineer at the dam site. And they have gone on an adventure to Istanbul. Aromas washed over Kevin like a wave when he pushed one of the heavy wooden doors, twice his height, spanned with iron bands and studded with nails the size of his fist, and entered Istanbul's spice bazaar. He stepped into the hazy golden light, and his senses were inundated with smells and colors and sounds. He felt like he could taste the air swirling around him as the massive door closed behind him. Nuts and beans rattled into bins. Cans and jars clinked against each other as they were stacked higher than Kevin would dare. Bakers placed cookies artfully like edible mosaics. Candy sellers carefully built structures of their rolls of freshly made sweets that reminded Kevin of the Lincoln Logs he played with as a kid. The merchants seemed so casual, shaping their powders and pods into steep pyramids, and Kevin wondered how it didn't all cascade over the rims of the boxes. Red, ochre, black, green, and even deep purple spices filled stall after stall. Some were labeled with just the price. Some had names displayed in Turkish and English, so now he knew that cumin was kimyon, oregano was kekik, anise was anason, and cinnamon was tarçın. He never knew there were so many colors of pepper: white, green, red, and black, mild, medium, and hot too. Then there was mother-in-law chili, which the vendor said was extra hot for unhappy brides to mix into their husband's mother's dinners. Kevin wondered if his mother ever did that to Gran. Gran would tell Mom her pie crusts were tough, her fried chicken soggy, and her cookies burnt. If there was an American version of mother-in-law chili, Gran probably deserved a helping of it, even if her fried chicken was way better than Mom's. So that's a little bit of Kevin. And this next one is in Paula's point of view. It's the Ross family has only been there a couple of days. Will has made his way over to her apartment. He needs to ask her a favor with respect to the children. And so they're having their first real conversation between the two of them. And she's making some Turkish coffee that they're going to sip while they do. Paula measured the water, then carefully spooned the fine dark grounds and sugar into the hammered copper coffee pot she treated herself to on her first trip to Istanbul. What really happened was Mrs. Browning, the teacher before me, moved to Ankara when her husband got a promotion. None of the other wives had the qualifications to teach the English-speaking kids, so they contracted me through the Calvert School. That's the curriculum we use. Then they built my apartment onto the back of the schoolhouse right before I got here. Is Mrs. Browning Gus Browning's wife? Will asked. One and the same, she said. I didn't realize he'd worked at the site. Oh, they were here at least 2 years before they moved to Ankara. Paula leaned back from the counter. Will sat with his elbows on his knees, her book in his hand, flipping pages. Angle of Repose? You're reading an engineering book? It's a novel, she said, by Wallace Stegner. That's an engineering term. I know, she said. It's a metaphor. He shook his head and set the book down. She poured the coffee, pleased with the thickness and burnished gold of its foam. She let the ground settle. The cups rattled on their saucers as she carried them into the living room. She handed one to him, then perched on the edge of her chair and took a sip. He followed suit. Their eyes met over the rims of their cups, then flickered away. What brought you to Kayakale? He asked. Have you ever been to West Virginia? She quipped. Can't say I have. Then so much for that joke. Anyway, my little town put me through college with the agreement that I'd come back and teach, which I did. At the end of those 4 years, it was time to go. This is a long way to go, especially for a young single gal, he said. Woman, she corrected, and I'm 27, not so young. Not so old either, pretty gutsy. I'll take that as a compliment, she said. I like an adventure. I'll drink to that, he said, hoisting his cup. And you found what you were looking for? Yes and no. He raised his eyebrows. Yes, it's an adventure to be halfway around the world, immersed in a different culture, learning a new language, having this landscape and all sorts of history to explore. And no, it doesn't feel good to be part of something I was trying to get away from. What were you trying to get away from, if that's not too personal? It's very personal, but not how you mean. I joke about it, but I love West Virginia. It's wild and lovely. And the mining and chemical companies, there's no nice way to say this. They're raping the land. I had no idea building a dam would do the same thing. I suppose that was naive on my part. Raping the land? That's pretty harsh, he said. Have you looked into that excavation? That's harsh. Plus, I don't know why it never occurred to me before I came here. There are towns and the people in them, and farmland and wildlife habitat and the wildlife that lives there, and even archaeological sites that are going to be drowned once the dam's done. Come on, that's a bit dramatic. We don't drown people. You haven't seen those villages. They've been here longer than our country's been in existence. You're right, though. The dam won't drown the people. It'll just uproot them. Some of those villagers have lived 80 or 90 years in that one place. And the term is inundate, right? I guess they're going to feel pretty darned inundated. There's a price you pay for progress, Will said. People have to move for big public works projects, but when they do, they have electricity and clean water and flood control and irrigation for their crops and infrastructure they've never had before to develop industry, and that helps the economy. They have to adjust, but it's clear the gains are greater than the losses. It's a foundation to build on, better and stronger. Really? What price are you paying? She asked. You're getting paid. Me too. Do you really think one of those villagers is going to end up a rich industrialist? More likely, they'll be slaving away for the industrialist who lives in a fancy penthouse in Istanbul or New York. Who gets to say what progress is? Paula finished her coffee and gazed down at the grounds. She felt Will's eyes on her and looked up. You're very sensitive, he said. I am, she said, and I like it that way. I didn't mean it as an insult, just an observation. In my opinion, building a dam is progress, and progress is a good thing. I'm here to get this dam built. You don't have to agree with me, but you should. What? She thought, did he really say that? That's pretty black and white. I think there are shades of gray with respect to how we define progress, she said. Is that another metaphor? He shrugged and patted the book, which was sitting on his lap. After you get to the angle of repose, things fall down. That's pretty black and white. I guess I don't get metaphors.
That's a great scene.
And then there's a short scene, and this is in Will's point of view. And they've taken a trip, the family has taken a trip with Paula. They're exploring a wonderful World Heritage Site in central Anatolia. It's called Nemrut Dağ, and it was built in the 1st century BCE by a Commagene king, Antiochus I. It's at the top of a mountain. There are 2 temples on the west and east side of a very large tumulus that it is speculated that Antiochus I is buried under, but it's not been confirmed. And the tumulus actually raised the elevation of the natural elevation of the mountain by 150 feet. The summit views were impressive, surrounded by jagged peaks of steeply dipping sedimentary rocks. You can tell this is the geologist's point of view, right? Surrounded by jagged peaks of steeply dipping sedimentary rocks, coarse-grained dark gray sandstones, and massive cream-colored limestones, the rocks they just scrambled over to get here. He turned to the tumulus, built by fist-sized angular pieces of the limestone. This had been constructed more than 2,000 years ago by hand-chipping stones from outcrops, hauling them to the top of the mountain and stacking them just shy of the angle of repose. Not the metaphorical angle of repose, he said, smiling to himself. The word grueling would hardly begin to convey work like that. It was an awesome accomplishment, but Will was baffled that any man, even a king, would presume that he could improve on what nature had provided. He advanced around the slope of the tumulus. He saw one, then the second of the deity's bodies, then the entire temple and his family in it. Kevin looked pensive, standing beside the head of a goddess, while Dee Dee sprinted around the scattered blocks and body parts as if the temple was her playground. And why not? Will liked to think of the world as his playground, something he hadn't felt for some time. That's why he loved flying and skiing, surfing and scuba diving, or moving around the world to take a job overseas. The challenge of the problem, the move, the moment, the setting, or the speed. You rode waves of adrenaline. You knew you were alive, every cell in your body singing. He wanted that feeling back. So that's a little bit of each of them.
Yeah.
And will you share some of
Yeah,
your characters with us?
It's so nice to finally be side by side with you. We have there's all these connections with home, and then, like, as you pointed out, both of our novels take place abroad, and 3 different points of view. I guess we've known this, but we haven't, like, we just met in person for the first time tonight.
Yes,
so
we've zoomed
I guess
together
it
lots
all
and
started
lots.
in the pandemic years ago. So yeah, I'll read just for a few minutes this moment where the American dollars appear, since I referenced that earlier. And this is from Asaya's point of view. So she's a 17-year-old Afghan woman. She's married and determined to get an education. She has left the house to go to the marketplace. So just please, like, call to mind where we are, that she would be in a full burqa. And she's walking alone, which is a problem. So let's see. She's placed her hand over a particularly ripe apricot when she sees them. Both stand nearly 6 feet tall, lean and limber as the cougars rumored to patrol the nearby slopes. How many years has it been since she's seen Taliban fighters in public? They're even laughing, as though one fighter has just told the other a joke. It's not so much their ammo and weapons as their iron stares and meticulously draped turbans that give them away, black coal ringing their eyes. Both men have bundled their turbans at the top, swooped them below their chins, then swaddled them across their faces, leaving only a slit for the eyes. She doesn't dare look directly, but that tiny opening of fabric, that suggestion of identity, if given the chance to show only one thing about herself, what might she reveal? The fruit vendor tisks, and Asaya feels a slap across the top of her hand. So few vendors will sell to her, this unright, supposedly Pashtun woman wandering the streets, and certainly not this vendor, not now that she's lingered too long, coveting the apricot immodestly. She turns from the booth and crosses to the other side of the path. Here is Masood. Maybe he will sell to her today. The naan smells so fresh she can almost taste it, and she's drawn to its doughy, charcoaled musk. She reaches out to select one of the toasted loaves. Of all the people she suspects could have started the false rumor about her family, she has never considered Masood. His daughters also went to Miss Darrow's language lessons with her. He even speaks to Asaya sometimes, if there's no one in line and he can busy himself with tasks as they whisper. But Masood has spotted the fighters too, and as quickly as Asaya approaches, he turns his back. She angles her body closer to his table display, as if the loaves of bread might stand in for her family, but Masood offers no indication that he's going to help her. From the corner of her eye, she sees the fighters make purchases several booths away. The apparent leader moves deftly, his hands bloodied at the knuckles. He selects cucumbers, dates, and a satchel of almonds. Only a portion of the exchange is visible through the screen of Asaya's burqa, and she shifts on her feet to bring a different view into focus. Money flashes, crisp green US dollar bills passed like poison seeds from the fighter to the vendor. 2 days' walk from a US base, a handful of years since any occupation, and here, an Afghan vendor taking American dollars without pause. She hasn't seen that currency since Miss Darrow showed the schoolgirls her purse one day, all the womanly items it contained. Such a treasure then. Now the image sends shrapnel through Asaya's chest. The money can mean only one thing. The Americans are coming, and if the Americans are coming, these Taliban will be waiting. The village of Amar will become a mere backdrop to their battle. Asaya wouldn't believe she has even seen the bills if it weren't for what happens next. The vendor casually making change and a little boy rounding the corner at top speed, running into the fighters and knocking the currency to the ground. You pest, the leader. The leader kicks at the boy, tangled in the fabric of his dishdasha. Several more bills drift through the air and coins tumble from his pocket. You dog, shouts the other fighter. Both grab for the money. The boy stands and dusts himself off. In the scuffle, a fresh date has fallen from his pocket and rolled into the dirt. He reaches for it, but not quickly enough. What's this? The Taliban fighter says mockingly. He swoops down and takes the date. Looks like we have a thief. The boy's eyes widen. Asaya leans toward Masood's booth. Do you see this? Friend, you have to help him. Get, Masood says, barely a whisper. He won't look at her. I'll leave, she says. Go help the boy. You get, Masood says again. Get back in a way, you dishonorable whore. The fighters look up, now curious, and Asaya's breath escapes in a wave. She rushes towards the boy. There you are, she says, grabbing his bony shoulders. She looks at the ground, addressing the fighter humbly. I'm sorry, my son was only doing errands for me. The boy blushes. He empties his pockets, shell casings, old springs, a broken pair of sunglasses, a plastic button. The stash tumbles from his hands as he tries offering it to the fighters. Over here, Masood calls, one free loaf for any servants of Allah, the most merciful, the most powerful. The fighters look up, and with that, Asaya and the boy are gone, slipped behind the nearest booth, between the side flaps of tents, past the hookah stand and the butcher's table, through a small huddle of goats, ducking under a display of headscarves, pushing through the line for the kebab vendor. And then it's just Asaya, the anonymity of her burqa, the stifling air, and her heart beating like the wings of a bird in her chest. So what's happening there? Well, later the boy will come back, but I hope you could sense that she got herself out of a pickle there. Just barely. So I think we're probably ready to move into questions.
There's some questions. Okay, who wants to be the point of the spear in the live audience? Be shy. You can do it. Question.
Yes.
Thank you. And don't forget to repeat it, please, for the virtual.
Okay.
I was going to say, is it a problem sometimes to constantly feel like you're writing yourself into some of the characters? I feel like that would be easy kind of line to fall into. I guess, do you read these books and you feel a lot of both of yourselves within the book, or is it something that you consciously try to detach yourself while you're writing to make characters that are not you?
Okay.
So the question was, is it difficult to avoid writing yourself into your fictional characters, and how does that tension show up during the writing process?
Right. Before I answer that, I'm just going to say, when we're signing, see me, because local authors need to support local independent bookstores, just like everybody, maybe more than everybody. So I have a gift card for the first question to Malaprops. So make sure you remind me. And I would say that for me, it's not so difficult, but I do think that pieces of ourselves, pieces of our experience, pieces of our views of the world do infuse themselves into our character. Well, I can only speak for myself, into my characters. Certainly, there's a sailing scene in this book, and someone in the front row has sailed with me. And when she read that scene, she was like, oh, that's like when you were teaching me on your boat. So clearly I wrote myself into this woman skipper of a sailboat. But one of the things I love about fiction, both reading it and writing it, and I can't take credit for this phrase, Amy Wallen, who's a novelist who spoke at my bookstore about her craft book, How to Write a Novel in 20 Pies, which is a great craft book, talked about how she loved that you can seek a truer truth in fiction. that you can really look for the essence of things you're exploring without feeling constrained by the facts and exactly what happened. And so I think that certainly we infuse our experiences and our views into our characters, but for me as a writer, I'm seeking those truer truths, and in fiction, there's a lot of freedom around that.
I'll just say briefly, one of the things I learned when my first book came out, and then it happened again with the second, but I was prepared, was people would meet me and be like just totally shocked. Like how did you, like, what did you even, they expected to meet perhaps maybe a veteran and a man and maybe someone who'd been to war. And they thought, where are you in this book? Like, you're not in it. And I felt like, what do you mean? Like, every ounce of my soul is in this book. And so sometimes we are in there, but it's just not so linear. So the spirit, the sense of longing that the characters have, the questions that they're asking are questions that we ask as humans.
And congratulations. That's what happens sometimes when we go first. Yeah, so that's really great. So we have a question from the virtual audience from Lucinda. Can you speak more about point of view? How do you gain that perspective? And without direct engagement, how do you earn credibility?
So Lucinda asks, can you speak more about point of view? And how do you earn credibility?
And I'm going to ask you to answer that
Oh,
first.
I was gonna
because
give it to you.
teach writing.
I feel like it's really personal point of view, but also there's a certain point at which, like what I described a little bit earlier, when I caught myself basically cheating in that 5th revision, where there was a problem I couldn't solve, and so I tried to solve it with point of view and I couldn't do it. So at the end of the day, I feel like if you're bringing the point of view and the story being told have to be like in lockstep, essential to each other. Only this story could be told from these points of view. And that's why you made that choice.
I think that's a great answer. And I'll actually maybe go a little further and you can correct me if I get this wrong from a craft standpoint. And that is, you can think of I think technically from a craft standpoint, when you say point of view, do you mean a first person point of view, a second person point of view, a third person point of view? So the I, you, he, she, they. But when we're talking about our point of view characters, it's what point of view are you, whose characters are you seeing the story through, and are you hearing it told to you through? And I know that I find it to be really playful to experiment with that, where I might be working on a short story, and I'll try it in first person point of view, and then play with it with second or third, and that play in the work. Is that an oxymoron to say the play in the work?
No, it's great.
The story kind of lets you know what's the right place for that.
Yeah. If you take your time and feel it in your body, there's usually information there.
Got another question? This side is blowing it up. Okay, over here. Okay, y'all just get warmed up. Okay, please.
So I know for me, I do a lot of technical writing. I think there are a lot of other folks in here that do a lot of technical writing, which is a very left-brained activity. How do you switch to it being right-brained and having the characters tell you what to write rather than, being in this very strict format and all that?
Right. And
so the question was, I'm just going to be the repeater because I want you to answer everything. This is it. I mean, this is a beautiful thing. The question was, especially since there are a lot of technical writers in the audience, the live audience tonight, how do you switch from the sort of left brain to right brain as a writer?
And I really had to learn that because I was a working environmental and engineering geologist when I started this book, and I wrote technical reports day in and day out. And it is very different to create a world and put people in it and make it engaging for readers than writing a good technical report. And I struggled with it actually a lot. And in the summer of 2007, I took a class with a writer by the name of Jeffrey Davis, who is also a yoga master. And it was called Writing from the Center to the Page, Yoga as Muse. And he also has a book by that title. And I learned that practice in that class and with that book, and I still use it today. And that really helped me. As I start a writing session, I ask myself, what am I writing for? In a pose. And there in his book and learning from him personally, there are certain asanas to move through that he just found. Like there's a certain series of movements I use when I think I'm going to write a dialogue that, has, you turn from one character to the other. And that made it possible for me to switch gears like that.
That's awesome. Great.
The next virtual question, I think, is best for wrapping up. So I will toss it back to the live audience. I know I have somebody here who raised their hand, but I'll give the other 2/3 of the audience a chance. If they've got a question, don't and sit there in silence.
Surely one of you civil engineers has a question about the dam. No?
I guess not.
I
They
guess
can
not.
talk and they can see you in a sidebar. Right,
Okay.
I'll talk to you later. Did you have a question?
I'm a civil engineer, and I'm curious how both of you, each of you, kind of gauge and measure how much explanation is needed for your readers and what's not. So for me, I understand what a bore log is, but that might be something totally brand new for someone. I don't have anyone in my family or close to anyone in the war. So how do you keep people engaged who are familiar, but also explain enough for people who are unfamiliar?
So the question from a civil engineer was, how do you keep people engaged, knowing that some of your readers are going to know the technical terms and others are going to be completely new to it? So how do you make those choices?
Yeah, I would say answering that question for myself was my biggest craft question to answer as I developed my skill as a writer. And what I found was that dropping smaller bits of it in and weaving the science, weaving the engineering, weaving the technical language through the fabric of the story itself in smaller bits felt less jarring and didn't take people out of the story. And you can still communicate a lot by putting it in little bits at a time. And one of the ways that I learned to check that is by reading it aloud. So as a creative writer, before I finish anything, and so this book, which got rewritten many times, I've probably read it aloud at least 6 times, I'm thinking, something like that. And sometimes I'll just do it with a few scenes at a time to see if it feels like it works. But if I start tripping over some of the language, or I feel like I'm reading a textbook out loud, then that's the clue that it's too much in one spot.
I think I touched on it a little with some of the examples that I gave, but for me, there's just creating context, and the vividness and authenticity of a world can really do a lot to readers. Are smart. So I also err on the side of like entertaining them on multiple levels and keeping their brains active and engaged. Like, I don't think I say in the book what an IED is. I made that assumption. I don't say what an MRE is. I did get a few questions about that, but guess what? It didn't ruin the story, So there, you win some, you lose some. But if the story is good enough, like, they're still going to turn the page.
We are at the top of the hour, so that means I get to pose the final question, and it is,
What's next?
So the final question is, what's next?
So I fancy that I'm about halfway through my second novel. I hope it won't take me another 8 years, like the second half of No More Empty Spaces did, or we'll be doing author events with me on a walker. So, its working title is Chances, and it is the story of a woman taking the helm of her life as she learns to command the helm of her sailboat, as told by the intrepid boat dog, who is her first mate.
Oh, that sounds fun. I'm working on a novel. It's set in West Virginia. It's not about war. It's about how to live with one foot in hope and one foot in despair. So in this case, mountaintop removal, but also sort of the tragedies within one particular family. And I've been working on it for maybe 6 or 7 years. There was a pandemic and a child and a profound illness all mixed into that, but I hope to have the first draft done by the end of this summer.
Well, congratulations, DJ. It's been a pleasure to have you and Katey in conversation to celebrate No More Empty Spaces.
Woohoo.